A considerable number of persons who bring in their troubles are concerned over the lack of trustworthiness in their associates, and I suspect they're a little concerned about the same lack in themselves. We like to overlook the personal equation when problems arise, but today the pressures of living certainly have a tendency to undermine our resolutions as these bear upon promises, indebtedness, and other basic relations between human beings. Out of considerable study and some observation, it is my conviction that the average person is basically trustworthy. Now, there can be exceptions to all rules, and we know there are some individuals who simply seem to lack the spark of integrity in their natures. But in the broad picture, the average person does have instincts which impel him to keep his word, preserve a certain reasonable degree of honesty, and practice personal integrity. If this basic structure exists, why do we not see more of it in our daily associations with others? Between the individual's instinct, which in most cases is sound, and his conduct, which is in most cases eccentric, there is an interval. And in that interval lies the great psychological complex of his mental and emotional life. It is in this mental emotional pattern that most of his troubles seem to originate. Now, both thought and emotion are subject to modification through education and conditioning. The individual can be educated out of the clarity of his own concepts. He can be educated out of honesty, integrity, loyalty. He can also be surrounded by inducements which he interprets as so necessary and real that he must compromise his principles for their fulfillment. He can also be adversely educated emotionally. He can be disillusioned, disappointed. He can find a whole group of negative attitudes which will have a tendency to neutralize his basic concept of integrity. It would seem, therefore, that our main problem lies in the individual thinking himself or talking himself or feeling himself out of his own honesty. Why this should be is rather obvious, yet we can regret it, and we can realize that it damages practically the whole social structure of our way of life. If, therefore, we turn upon ourselves to examine the degree to which we can be trusted, we must first of all examine thoroughly our own mental and emotional patterns. We will probably observe, as most do, that the individual is most trustworthy when his mind is off of himself. He is most honest in those transactions and relations which do not directly or personally profit himself. He is also inclined to rise to unusual heights of integrity in emergency of all kind, inasmuch as emergency breaks through habits. forcing the individual into a comparatively unknown situation. He reacts with his basic temperament rather than with his acquired inclinations. Thus, in moments of tragedy, under adversity, under war, plague, disaster, the average person exhibits marked strength of character. He finds that in an emergency, he develops resources that he did not know he possessed. And we get a whole group of reports about this in such a comparatively common field as driving an automobile. Nearly everyone has pointed out that in a ticklish or difficult situation, a kind of calmness has a tendency to appear. Time intervals disappear. And as one said not long ago, in almost every emergency of this kind, there is nearly always time to make an intelligent decision. Although it is a split second in human timing, the mind suddenly gains the dimension of being able to explore it and integrate it thoroughly in a fraction of a minute. This is because we suddenly direct our entire attention. We forget ourselves and we become identical with the emergency situation. Under these pressures, the average person will make a wise, thoughtful, careful, and even unselfish decision. There being this stratum of integrity at the root of things, we have a great deal to build upon if we want to find real answers to pressing problems. We therefore observe that our greater selfishness relates to our luxury thinking, that we are most dishonest mentally and emotionally about things of secondary importance. If, however, we permit this dishonesty to continue, it may create critical situations that are of primary importance. How far, then, should we say the individual can trust himself? He can trust himself about as far as his religion, his ethics, and his philosophy can direct him. We have to realize, furthermore, that his ethics, his religion, and his philosophy are essentially innate. We train them, we direct them. But the individual without certain values does not seek training or direction. If, therefore, he is making some effort to organize his life constructively, he is doing so primarily because of constructive instincts in his own nature. Perhaps these have been strengthened by mistakes, and he is attempting not to do again that which has previously caused trouble. But even this reflection arises in his own nature. If, therefore, we can allow the values in ourselves to have a chance, they will usually guide us more or less intelligently. Our forefathers, of a more simple religious mind, in most of their great emergencies, resorted to prayer. They sought to calm the troubled surface of their thinking and their emotions. They sought what they considered divine guidance. And coming humbly and quietly, thoughtfully, into a relationship with value, into a contact with what they regarded to be as the spiritual measuring rod of action, they usually came to a conclusion or a decision consistent with the structure of their religious belief. If they were naturally narrow-minded, their decision was narrow-minded, but it was sincere within the pattern of their ability. On the older platforms of philosophy, we know that nearly all of the great classical philosophic systems invited the individual to contemplation. They invited him to meditate upon realities, upon the great foundations of ethics existing in space and in the world. They advised each individual in the face of problem to relax, to be still, and to find within himself that guidance which has been divinely bestowed upon man. Under such conditions, the decision was usually a total conclusion, arrived at out of the total experience of life. This does not mean that various persons confronted with the same type of problem would come to identical conclusions. It would mean, however, that they came to a conclusion that they could use, that would help them, and usually a conclusion with a certain inspirational factor of trying to do better, or trying to be more sincere, or more true to the principles involved. Thus we also observe that where the individual loses this internal contact, his decisions are apt to lose a certain amount of integrity. On the modern platform of thinking, we have added what might be termed a scientific method to ancient concepts. We now think of law and order as scientific values. We have a feeling of that law, the law of cause and effect operates. We have a certain inward realization that if we break certain laws, we will come to grief. And out of this more or less scientific attitude comes a strong instinct towards keeping pattern, toward being in harmony with the broad structure of values involved in a situation. We may no longer rationalize or philosophize or theologize, but we still have what we call common sense, and science is nothing more or less than organized common sense. Thus, with the modern man, his values are based upon utilities more than in older times. But utility sounds the same general note. It is another name for almost the same level of action that we once regarded as theological or philosophical. Utility tells us today, for example, that we must work together, that a certain measure of cooperation is necessary to survival. The ancient theologians might have said that this was the brotherhood of man. The philosophers might have said that this was the way of friendship. The modern industrialist, economist, may say this is just plain good sense. On all levels, however, integrity has a tendency to operate in an almost identical manner. It seldom, if ever, varies from its basic formulas, and these formulas become our strength in an emergency. Many persons today have lost the strength of membership or dependency upon some strong policy-forming group, attitude, concept, or conviction. They no longer derive their ethics from patterns. This, in a way, places additional responsibility upon the individual. It forces him to make decisions for himself which were once common decisions. It also reveals to him a society of persons making diverse decisions, therefore not offering him an immediate pattern to follow. He therefore discovers that it is perfectly possible for him to act in a number of ways, and at the same time not too seriously affect his social relationships. Older man could not do this. In his community there was only one way of action, and he either conformed or he was gradually ostracized. He was forced to turn away from everything that was familiar to him, unless he kept the pattern of the way of life into which he was born, or with which he had thrown his lot in community existence. These values not any longer protecting us, man has a considerable need for internal reflection. Yet today, perhaps more than at any other time in recent history, man is not a contemplative being. He does not have the security of a powerful internal life. Now, we might deny this. We might say that many persons have a powerful internal life. My experience with those cases is that too many of them have a powerful mental emotional life, but are unable to penetrate it to any core of solid value underneath. The individual today considers an intellectual career as an internal life. He feels that if he is busy thinking, he is living strongly in himself. He also believes that if he is in the constant pressure of an emotional whirlwind inside himself, that this is a truly internal way of life. So he takes into himself all kinds of negative and confused ideas. He becomes more and more a victim of them. They exercise increasing pressure upon his conduct, and it is this pressure coming from inside that he mistakes for solid integrity. He believes because it flows out from somewhere within him that it must be from the fountains of his own spiritual life. In most cases, this is not true. He is not moving from value, he is moving from prejudice, concept, and opinion. These he has accepted. They have become factors, but they do not represent his own real nature having an opportunity to express itself. If, therefore, this internal nature is confused, is uncertain in its own convictions, or is moving from one pattern of conviction to another almost constantly, this is a weakness within rather than a strength. The degree to which a concept is broken up, becoming a number of divergent policies, to that degree the strength of action is reduced. It therefore would appear that the individual, in order to know how far he can trust himself, must begin to ask a few simple and natural questions of himself. He is the only one who can answer these questions with certainty. Those around him can tell him the degree to which he is able to transform his own convictions into conduct. They know, perhaps better than he does, whether his life is well integrated, whether he is a practical person, and whether he is a trustworthy person. However, he himself can examine the probabilities of these values being present in a mature way by looking into his own reactions, his own instinctive reflexes upon problems. The classical philosophies took the attitude that the individual does not become honest. There is no way in which you can take a dishonest person and force honesty upon him. This is behind our entire concept of penal correction. We put persons into prison. We keep them there for 10 years for bank robbery. The day after they are released, they rob another bank. The only thing that has happened is that through long and careful meditation, they have learned to do a better job of it. They enter prison as amateurs and leave as professionals. And society is faced with this dilemma. We cannot make a person honest. The reason for that is that honesty is not something that is acquired. Honesty is a natural and simple state of things. Honesty, in a strange way, is neither a thing in itself, nor is it built upon other things in themselves. For the average person, honesty is simply the state of not being dishonest. Honesty, therefore, is that which remains when false values are removed. The value in man, the instinct, the integrity locked within the human being is always there. The problem of discovering it involves the removal of that which is not like it. Therefore, an individual can recover from dishonesty, but he cannot recover from honesty. Dishonesty can be reduced, and to the degree that it is reduced, honesty remains. The honest man is simply the individual who is not misusing abilities, talents, opportunities. He is not a person who has acquired a new gift. He is a person who has accepted the core of his own life and is living according to it. In then trying to analyze this, we are in the presence of the process of removing those things from our thoughts and emotions which prevent us from being honest. We used to say that the reason behind dishonesty was ignorance. Well, ignorance is essentially behind all difficulties. But in our particular case, ignorance usually takes the form of a false estimation of self and a false explanation of remedy for what needs to be accomplished. No person who carries within their own natures a heavy load of psychological pressure can be truly honest, any more than a person filled with the symptoms and indications of a disease can be truly well. If there is present, therefore, such mental and emotional factors as constitute mental and emotional disease, whether so diagnosed or not, we cannot expect conduct which is propelled by mental and emotional tendency to be entirely different from the propelling power behind it. Honesty, then, is the process of examining the merit and demerit of our own assumed attitudes, and, if possible, removing such as are detrimental to the natural expression of our integrity. Many of these attitudes are highly individual. A majority, however, will probably be collective. We are influenced profoundly by the mass attitudes of our times. We have a strong inclination to fall back upon the old habit of letting other people do our thinking for us. Today, therefore, we are the victims of all kinds of propagandic ideas, ideas that are profitable to someone, perhaps only in terms of selfishness, profitable to someone at the expense of others. If we fall for these pressures, we simply contribute to the continuation of an unreasonable and unfair social situation. Yet by nature and habit, we rather conform. We like to take certain general positions and remain with them, supported as far as possible by the cooperation or agreement of our associates. While we take this attitude, we are essentially weak, and we permit our associates and our environment to take over totally the integration of our lives. The end is inevitably disintegration. There can be no other consequence. No other person can live our life for us in a truly effective manner. There is an old saying, and I think it is true, that nearly all countries would rather be governed by a poor ruler of their own than a good ruler imposed upon them by others. And most of us as individuals much prefer to live badly according to our own convictions than to live better in slavery or bondage to the convictions of another person whose attitudes appear tyrannical to us. Nature has intended that we should move toward our own center and govern ourselves by ourselves. And nature will accept nothing else. And wherever this issue is avoided, nature shows displeasure by bringing upon us a number of complications. Complications intended to force the value back into our own natures. In all these situations, we must therefore ask ourselves frankly, what is the internal pattern by which we operate? If this pattern is wrong, we are in servitude to it. We will compromise other values for it. And frequently this compromise is no longer a decision. It is merely an habitual procedure. By degrees, we lose all instinct to even examine our actions, taking it for granted that whatever feeling or emotion we have is inevitable. This must be done. This must be fulfilled or gratified, regardless of the misery or sorrow it may cause. On our level of thinking, one of the greatest problems that we face in human nature is the problem of intolerance. Under intolerance, perhaps, we should also include prejudice. These two together form a very powerful cause of false action. Even persons who claim to be comparatively highly integrated, with many noble sentiments and attitudes locked within themselves, nurse for some reason various intemperances towards other persons, towards groups, towards religions, towards races, towards nations. And these deep-set emotional mental habits take over our relationships and give us what we all definitely desire, and that is an excuse for being less than ourselves, an excuse to escape from labor, an excuse to avoid or evade responsibility, and perhaps an excuse for not growing big enough to see through the problem. Wherever weakness comes in, we use it as an excuse mechanism. When someone points out one of our faults, for example, we will turn around in all probability and point out a bigger one in them. Having therefore achieved what we would regard as a signal victory, we settle down to continue the complacent maintenance of our own delinquency. We have completely overlooked the fact that the other person's fault is essentially his business. Our fault is our business. If his fault is such that it annoys us, disquiets us, we have a right to withdraw from association with that person, or else to ignore, so far as possible, that phase of his nature which is unpleasant. But we can never retire from our own fault. We can never ignore it. We are burdened with it to the end of time. This is one of the reasons why nearly all religious communities have come to grief. Every so often, groups of persons, disappointed, disillusioned, heartbroken over the delinquencies of mankind, decide to retire from the common relationships of others and create some kind of a Shangri-La of their own. They go off somewhere and start a community. But unfortunately, each one of these persons takes to that community his own nature. And his own nature has always been the greatest cause of his difficulty. Therefore, isolated with a number of others like himself, most of them probably a little neurotic, and some of them considerably psychotic, the community almost certainly turns into bedlam. And in a short time, every sin of society reappears in the community in its most unfortunate form, a sin that is sanctified by theology, a sin that has been made sacred because the entire program was carried on a high idealistic level. In common society, we expect difficulties, but where a group of persons gathers together with the noblest of resolutions and then acts worse than those who have no resolutions, the situation is exaggerated and made more unfortunate. In this way, we must face always that we cannot escape the pattern of personality which is controlling us. Our friends may excuse it, our associates may ignore it, a number of persons may be fond of us in spite of these things, but still they are constantly working against us. They are mental and emotional termites, undermining our integrity and constitution continuously. We are therefore frequently hampered, blocked, frustrated in some of the most reasonable and natural probabilities of living, simply because we have an uncorrected personality problem. In industry today, this is being given the greatest thought. It is being discovered that persons with high abilities are not always the persons suitable for an executive position. It is the individual who has achieved freedom from intolerance and prejudice who is largely sought for, because he is the only person who has the gift of being honest. He is the only individual who can place some large policy ahead of some small, irritating superstition in himself. Most of our unhappy, negative attitudes do rise from some kind of personal experience. We have a disappointment or a reverse, or we have come through a long negative conditioning, perhaps even from childhood, broken homes and things of that nature. And we come to maturity loaded with negations, loaded with unpleasant attitudes about things, about persons, and about conditions. We have completely overlooked the fact that human beings are individuals, that we cannot make broad statements about them that will usually be true. And we are forever in the presence of the exception to our own prejudice, if we are willing to face it. It is therefore wiser for us to lower the pressure of these intensities and try to recognize the importance of meeting each individual as an individual, and not as another example of some preconception of our own. 99 persons may have done a certain thing to us, but this in no way means that 100th person must. The trouble is that by the time 4 or 5, to say nothing of 99, individuals have injured us in some way, we become injury conscious. We become hypercritical and hyperdefensive, or else we develop a powerful escape instinct. I've had people come to me and say, well, I was in business. I had a dishonest business associate. I'll never go into business again. That's final. Thus, by creating a pattern of this kind, the individual locks himself. Another will say, I had a bad marriage. I will never marry again. Locking themselves on the assumption that whatever has happened must forever happen. And the injury caused by one person may be passed on to others who are totally innocent as the basis of bad judgment. Once a person stands firmly behind a wrong decision, he is almost certain to make it come true. He will continue to live limited, restricted, deformed psychologically by his own decision, until at last perhaps he will be just as unpleasant as would cause a continuous cycle of distress for himself. It is then almost necessary for each person who is a little tired and a little weary with worldliness and the problems that he must face to begin to find out whether these problems are real or whether they are merely the result of the way in which he faces everything. If he has a tendency to make a problem out of everything, he will have nothing but problem. If, however, he has a tendency not to make problem out of everything, problem will disappear very largely from his life. These experiments have been made. They have been proved true. And it has been shown that a major change in the individual's basic value will change the entire pattern of his life. The only way he can make this change, however, is to release something wrong. The problem of doing right is something that is very difficult for us, because frankly we do not know what right is. It is easy enough for everyone to tell us, but when they all get through, we know no more than we did before. An individual will say to himself, what is the right thing to do in this situation? He will look around and collapse in confusion. He does not have the discrimination. He does not have the technical knowledge. He does not have the spiritual insight to know with certainty what is right. In some very simple problems, he probably does have enough knowledge. But by the time it gets into a really involved major issue in life, he does not know. He does, however, know certain things that are not right. He knows with his own conscience that there are attitudes which he cannot take without offense to himself. He realizes there are principles which he is breaking. He also may have in the back of his mind a certain vision of how things could be in a way more favorable, more harmonious, more desirable. He therefore cannot always say, this I should do. But usually he can say, this I should not do. And as we must always arrive at our positive definition by negative definition, he begins to see things that could be changed, rather eliminated, recognizing that the moment something is dropped from his own armament, he is changed. He is changed because other values that are more real always take the place of those we let go. If, therefore, there is a basic desire to do a thing as well as we can, the first problem is to get rid of the attitudes by which we prevent ourselves from doing anything as well as we can. Another very common problem in this is ulterior motive. And ulterior motive is a breeder of disaster of all kinds. The individual who is seeking constantly to find a way along a policy of self-profit, self-satisfaction, or self-aggrandizement will always be in trouble. The moment he is no longer honest because he desires something special for himself and is willing to take it at the expense of another, the moment he falls into this habit, he may make the small gain that he wants, but this small gain will be followed by an endless cycle of difficulties and tragedies. He has been false to a principle already, and if he makes this principle dominant in his life, he will be under it forever. And this is a principle that will never produce any real good. We will say, of course, that in daily living, the individual must watch out for himself. If he does not protect his own goods, if he is not thoughtful and careful, he will certainly be defrauded by others. This may also be phenomenally true, nor are we expected to ignore such an element or such a consideration. But it is also very true that the protection of our goods, the rational use of our own abilities, does not mean the exploitation of others. It means that rather, again, we place ourselves in a condition in which we are not easily exploited by others. The individual who is essentially honest is a very difficult person to cheat. Now, many persons say that that is not so. You will hear them say, well, I was honest. I believed the best about him. I trusted him implicitly. And he went off with everything I had. Now, we know such cases to happen, but I can assure you that they are not the result of honesty. They are the result of sentimentalism, often accompanied by glamour, and very frequently accompanied by the hope for unreasonable profit. The individual, expecting to get something for nothing, loses everything that he has. But people are not so imposed upon simply because they are trying to live right. They are imposed upon because of a series of mental and emotional quirks in their own nature. One individual is imposed upon because he is lonely and friendless. And when someone comes along who seems to be friendly, he loses all sense of orientation, and simply to fill in his own loneliness, loses critical judgment, and becomes a hopeless victim of someone else. Another person, desperately desirous of advancement, will cultivate someone whom he believes can be profitable to him. In a little while, it's the other person that makes the profit. Then everyone is heartbroken. But behind all of these various impositions, these so-called injustices, there is nearly always a strong core of selfishness in the person that gets hurt. And while he will then go and nurse his hurts, claim himself to be as innocent as a newborn babe, and proceed to shift all the responsibility onto others, the fact is that in most instances he was totally to blame himself. He was to blame because he tried to make virtues out of negative attitudes. He's to blame because he used weakness to move from rather than strength. In his desperate desire for some satisfaction of his own, he permitted himself to be led astray or to affirm and believe things which could not be true, never were true, and never will be true. But when we want them to be true badly enough, they can appear to be true. And under this glamour of an appearance, we are led into bad thinking, bad reaction to problems. Under such situations, it becomes pretty evident that in order to be trustworthy, we must have some core of security in our own natures. The person who is internally secure does not need to compromise in order to attain security. Therefore, dishonesty is always related to insecurity. And dishonesty is not always the individual going out and stealing something. Dishonesty is the procedure of placing ourselves in such a situation that we invite other persons to exploit us, that we invite a situation that is not good, if such an invitation will ultimately be accepted. If we have a core of value, and this core of value enables us to adjust to the ordinary problems of living with reasonable efficiency, we are very likely to be trustworthy in our relations with ourselves and other people. If, however, we are weak to a point of desperation in the way that we must turn to something, whether it is right or wrong, we must do something, whether it is good or bad, such emergencies nearly always destroy our basic trustworthiness. We gradually develop a pattern of compromise, and the moment compromise takes over, basic value vanishes. Thus, in looking into our own natures, we have to analyze the situation. Many years ago, the man I followed as a minister in the Church of the People here in Los Angeles, Dr. Reynold E. Blight, said one morning, one of his talks, how much is a man worth after he has lost everything he has? This is a very important problem. The individual who is worth less is worthless. He will be worth exactly what he had prior to the gain or loss of any external thing. And trustworthiness is based upon the deeper part of us that is not affected by gain or loss. If loss unseats us, then we are the victim of the psychology of loss throughout life. If gain causes us to compromise principles, we will then be on the pedestal of compromise forever. And both of these attitudes are destructive to integrity and honesty. The individual, therefore, who has resources inside of his own nature, which will permit him to endure a hardship rather than compromise a principle, this person is trustworthy. The individual who says within himself, everything in this world I see I would like, but I only expect what I earn, that individual will probably be trustworthy. The individual who will go promiscuously into debt for himself is not trustworthy. Not only is he not trustworthy as a bank risk, he is not trustworthy as a person because he lacks self-control. The individual who caters continuously and forever in the hope of some advantage is not trustworthy because he will always compromise for advantage. An individual whose ambitions are so strong that he will sacrifice to his ambitions the better part of his own character, whose ambitions will prevent him from maturing as a person, whose ambitions will permit him to neglect his family for the sake of his career. That individual is not trustworthy, even in his career. Yes, he may go quite a ways, but when the firm turns to him in an emergency, they find he's dropped dead of a heart attack. He is not an integrated person. And wherever his principles are in servitude to pressures, he cannot trust himself, for he has the experience of reasoning himself out of honesty, of emotionalizing his own convictions until they please him. And by him I now mean his personal egoic ambition center. Any person who generalizes on any particular, affirming that all dogs are like the dog that bit him, such a person is not trustworthy, because in the presence of an emergency, the complexion of a man's skin, the faith he belongs to or the race he belongs to, will be used against him or for him to the exclusion of integrity. Wherever, then, the individual is under the pressures of false attitudes, his own ability to direct his own life is impoverished. And while this continues, he cannot trust himself. Now, there are many ways in which this situation can be improved. Seldom, however, by a head-on attack. We cannot sit down and by a powerful volition of the will overcome the habit mechanisms of a lifetime. If we do, we are apt to put such a strain upon our nervous systems that we will collapse from some other cause. And it is perfectly possible to collapse trying to be good. Then, of course, we really do have something to pity ourselves about. The only basic answer is more or less to forget ourselves and to build values, probably through attained contact, through study, through thought, through a reflective way of life, and through the practical process of creating securities in our own immediate environment, adding in any way that we can to the security of our health, of our basic emotional poise, adding to the security of our home, building our friendships more deeply and securely, gaining the natural respect and admiration of persons whose attitudes we consider valuable or important to us. Doing these things by earning them, not by telling people what we are, but by showing them what we are. And when the exhibition is proper, the recognition will generally follow. But we have to begin to get rid of the weaknesses by means of which our own judgment is constantly impaired. Let us remember one thing always, that our judgment, our thought, and our emotion on any subject is always from the total availability. As long as there is one weakness in our basic integrity in relationship to living and thinking, there will be fault in any judgment that we make. A person with no self-control, little if any integration, and no security cannot come up with a miraculously infallible solution to problems. The solution depends upon the solving power of our own total nature. And while we are neglecting some major part of ourselves, the value of this part in our decision is not available to us. Therefore, we say that truth is an extremely difficult thing to find, and that the absolute solution to problem is beyond us. But a relative solution means that we find an answer suitable to our immediate need and suitable to our immediate characters, and that this solution in turn opens the way to further thoughtfulness, leading ultimately to better solution. We grow step by step from inaccuracy toward accuracy of attitude. Now, when we begin to contemplate the relation of this to other people, we are in the same position. We are other people. The persons we know, the associates we have, the strangers we may meet, are persons like ourselves, with also their loads of insecurities and their terrible entanglements in secondary intellectual emotional processes. The individual that we meet is not a great, big, strong, well-organized person who is primarily determined to be dishonest. It is true that he may be a schemer. It is true that he may have ulterior motives of 1,000 varieties. But this is not because he is a bad person looking for a victim, any more than we are bad persons looking for victims. He is an unadjusted, insecure person, likewise in bondage to his own instincts, appetites, desires, and ambitions. He may have a somewhat more exaggerated case of it than we have. Perhaps only we think so. And to other people, our case is just as bad as other people's appear to us. In any event, however, nature has produced very few actually bad persons. Nature produces a great many frightened people. It produces a vast number of insecure people. It also produces a number of very lonely, helpless people. The world is full of individuals whose temperaments and dispositions have set them in patterns that are uncomfortable and unsatisfactory. And just as an individual sitting down in a chair, discovering that he is sitting on a pin, is most likely to move abruptly, so the individual whose life is itself uncomfortable is constantly seeking to escape from it, seeking frequently with irritation and with negative dislikes to find some explanation for his own trouble. The majority of persons that we will meet, allowing that we do not have to have contact with a few habitual criminals, or habitual delinquents. The persons we will normally meet are not bad people, they are uncomfortable people. And today, the average person, when he is uncomfortable, can only think of one thing: be unpleasant. It never occurs to him that there is no real need for him to transform his internal negative pressure into an external situation that will make it worse. But all of us do the same thing. When we're a little uncomfortable, we're angry. When we're a little tired, we're fussy. When we don't feel good, we're irritable. And when anyone says anything to us, we snap back at them as quickly as we can. Well, if you felt the way I did, you'd do the same thing. Yet this is not true. There are many persons who feel much worse than we feel, whom we envy because they seem to be so happy. It's a different attitude, a different approach to life. But this problem of immediately transforming internal irritation into unpleasantness happens to us when we understand ourselves so well that we know why it happened, and we're full of excuses. But when another person does the same thing, we do not understand them so well. Consequently, they are just plain unpleasant. I've seen this happen in the course of an evening with a dozen persons in one room, gathering together socially, each individual condemning others in that group and away from it for precisely the things he was doing at the very moment himself. But he knows why he does it. He had a bad day at the office. Everything went wrong. The federal income tax people moved in. Everything caused a bad day. And this person took it out by simply being unpleasant. And the only way he could think of relaxing from this unpleasantness was to have a great big strong drink. Let down. Get himself off his mind. So he did it. A few moments later, he was well off of his own mind. And by the way, on everybody else's hands. So this is the way in which these things happen. And it's quite natural for us to feel that these persons are not just the folks we like. But on the same occasion, we are doing it likewise. Always able to explain ourselves, always hesitant to suspect anyone else of good. While this situation goes along, obviously, we cannot trust other people, perhaps largely because we know that these persons may influence us, and we cannot trust ourselves to stand the influence. If we knew what we were doing, where we were going, and why, we would not worry about other people doing us very much harm. Because it's very difficult to interfere with a well-established program. But where there's no program, and other people have stronger wills or better arguments than we have, we're liable to wake up in a sort of hypnosis and find that we are over-influenced. We're afraid of this. But it is not the strength of the other person's influence. It is the weakness of our own resistance. It all comes back again to ourselves. It is very difficult to injure a person who knows what he's doing. And the person who doesn't know what he's doing is an open invitation for over-influence. The weaker we become, the more other people move in. And the more they move in, the less they admire us. For very few people deeply admire a person they've over-influenced. One of the results of this, of course, is very ludicrous if it wasn't tragic. By the time we have changed other people until they're what we think they should be, we cannot get along with them any longer. We discover that in practice, our reforming job was a dismal failure. If we cannot get along with people as they are, we can never get along with them after we've reformed them. For in simple fact, we don't know how to reform anybody. And what we mean by reforming them is to make them agree with us. But as we've never agreed with ourselves since the day we were born, just what happens when we get other people to agree with us? They will never agree with themselves again as long as they live. What we therefore seek is not conformity, but a comradeship in which each person is tolerant of the other person's attitudes and ideas, that we can share and we can accept if we find something worthwhile. But we are not overwhelmed by oratory, nor are we under the hypnosis that a very successful person is speaking, nor are we under the negative factor that it is our moral duty to listen to certain persons. All these attitudes are false, and they lead naturally to trouble. Someone says, if we are not constantly suspicious of other people, we're liable to lose everything we have. That is not true. We do not have to suspect persons of the worst any more than we have to suspect them of the best. The thing we should do is suspect ourselves of being foolish, therefore likely to be easily over-influenced by someone else. As long as we have a positive status inside, we do not need to be suspicious, because the other person can only hurt our weaknesses, not our strength. And their power to in any way injure us depends upon the open invitation of our weakness. Therefore, we can assume and should assume that other human beings are like ourselves, with faults and virtues not so different from our own, that most of these other persons also have breaking points within their own temperament. They can be honest to a degree, and then prejudice or selfishness take over. The same is true of ourselves. They may have vices in areas which have never been a problem to us. Therefore, we look down our nose on them. One individual who has never been problemed at all with alcoholism never was interested in it. His own chemistry never required it or never impelled him to it. Has no sympathy whatever for an individual who has this problem, and will come out with some bright statement, say, well, I didn't drink. This is a note of extraordinary helpfulness, usually leading the drunkard to take another drink. This forever answering of other persons' problems by reference to self is one of the most aggravating things in the world, because it implies that other people are ourselves, and they are not. If they had come up through exactly the background we had, if they had come up with the same parents that we have, had lived in the same town, gone to the same school, attended the same church, and known the same persons, there might have been some validity in it. Then not too much, because children in one family are very different. But to simply condemn a person because he has weaknesses that we do not should give us a cause for pause, because the chances are 1,000,000 to 1 that we also have weaknesses which he does not have. We may not have the same ones, but we have some of them, or we wouldn't be here. And the individuals who are usually most critical are the ones in the most trouble. And their very criticism is itself a weakness, which can often be more dangerous than some of the prescribed delinquencies that we have learned to recognize. Criticism is a terrible weakness. It is a weakness that will ultimately take the beauty out of everything and probably end in a cynicism which will also take God out of the universe. Criticism is not a help. So when someone comes to us and we begin to look them over, we begin to feel that we want to trust them, but we do not know whether we should trust them or not, let's see what makes people trust people. One individual who had bought a large amount of non-existing uranium stock not long ago trusted the person who brought it because that person was such an understanding soul. Obviously a person of the greatest integrity. Why? It seemed to me rather strange that an individual could discover these things in 2 or 3 brief interviews, while the other person was talking mostly about making a sale. So I said, how did you know this person was a highly evolved individual with great understanding? And the friend finally, with a sort of a apologetic look, because they realized just exactly what had happened, said, well, of course, we thought they were that way. Why? Because they immediately recognized us as superior persons. In other words, an individual with a frustrated ambition to be admired was recognized as admirable by somebody who wanted to sell him something. And because of flattery, this person was talked out of the larger part of their worldly goods. It was not the shrewdness or the tremendous ability of the salesman. It was that he said exactly what the person wanted to hear. And that is that this person himself was a simply wonderful individual. So the check was made out immediately. Is it not reasonably obvious that the difficulty was not that the other person should not have been trusted? It was that we should not have permitted ourselves to accept flattery where we knew it wasn't justified. And having swallowed the flattery, which became a kind of anesthesia, we were easily separated from anything else. So the real problem, again, was our own weakness. Another individual was toadied to and catered to for years by someone who simply wanted what he had. He knew it, but he loved it. And this condition went on until finally, as might be expected, it broke out into a very serious misunderstanding, because the one that had done the toading finally got fed up, and the whole thing fell to pieces. So this person who had the wealth, and therefore was the one being toadied to, came and declared that he was totally disillusioned, that this other individual had simply been a false friend interested in what he had. So I said to the man, didn't you know this? Don't you know that an individual who has very little of this worldly goods and hangs around you forever with no inclination to work and doing everything you want them to do, that this person is out after something? Well, he said, I knew it, but I liked it. Who's to blame? Is it the other person? Or is it the fact that this wealthy man kept holding out inducements, most of which were never fulfilled, holding on to this individual, simply because he liked to be waited on by somebody, and by his natural temperament he couldn't earn a real friend? Was it the fault of the other person? Or was it a very strong case where we created such an opportunity mechanism in ourselves that it would take a very strong person to disregard it or ignore it. Instead of being critical of people around us, it is far better to take our own position strongly on some principle and some pattern. It may mean that we will lose from our circle of associates persons without principle, but they're the ones we'll have trouble with. We will, however, gradually draw to us people who do not need something because they have principles of their own. One of our difficulties, of course, is that one of our weaknesses takes the form of our desperate desire to be needed. And under all these desperate moods, we get into the same trouble. There is no reason why we should have a desperate desire to be needed, because we are needed. But most of the persons who have the desire will not go out and do necessary things that immediately require doing. They want to move this need onto a psychological level and have it cuddled by someone. We are all necessary. Therefore, there is no need to compromise integrity in order to try to ingratiate ourselves into some kind of a situation. There is work for everyone of some kind, and even if it may not be economically productive, it may at the same time be tremendously valuable in terms of the building of character and the satisfaction of our own internal living. And without this satisfaction, even our economic status is uncertain. Do not then be critical. Do not keep measuring and weighing to find out whether another person is honest. Rather, try to decide in your own nature how honest you are. Look back over your life and examine your troubles and see how many of them rose from great strength of character. You'll find very few. You will find that most of them rose either from weakness or stubbornness, that situations were not reasonably and fairly handled. On the basis of this, face the new situations that arise. Recognize simply and straightly that it is not necessary for you to constantly lie awake at night trying to figure out who's honest and who isn't. It can well be that you may move in a group of persons of very moderate integrity, but that does not mean that it rubs off. That does not mean that it can touch you unless you compromise yourself first. Instead of taking an attitude, therefore, of criticism, experience and good psychology tell us that it is much better to take the general attitude of constructive expectancy. We assume and affirm that we are not going to contribute to the delinquency of anyone. Therefore, we have a right to assume that this other individual is going to meet us halfway, that he is going to show whatever strength of character he possesses, and in an emergency, he is going to be as fair as he knows how. And regardless of these situations, we are not in the position to be a victim, because we are not exposing ourselves unnecessarily to the consequences of the weakness of our own temperament. Under such a more positive relationship, we can sometimes contribute considerably to the integration of other people, in the sense that we do not play on their weakness. We do not form a new pattern of escape for them. We place them upon a level of honor in which we call upon them to keep principles firmly and correctly. And you'd be surprised how many persons will react under that, especially now, as very few expect to be met with strength. Very few expect to be placed on honor. And if they are, and they finally realize the person who puts them there means it and is himself honorable, one of two things must happen. They will either go along finding a new sense of security in life, or sometimes it is security to discover that some other person is straight. It is sometimes the most inspiring and hopeful experience we can have. And if the person is of the wrong temperament and is simply not interested and not able to make this adjustment, he will drift away into other associations without leaving a great tragedy anywhere, as long as we have been fair. But if we give too much of ourselves to unknown factors, if we expect too much of other people, we are in trouble. One of the most difficult persons to live with in the world is a perfectionist. Now, a perfectionist is sometimes a delightful, abstract person. There's nothing that is more, perhaps, stimulating than the desire to do things perfectly. But the probabilities of attainment are so slight that there has to be also a marked amount of patience and an ability to recognize limitation. If this is totally absent, and the individual is simply a perfectionist, the only answer for him is to turn and consider himself and start to work there. This is usually his last field of interest, however. When we demand more of others than we can offer in ourselves, we are also in trouble. And remember this, that everyone has more or less of something, including ourselves. And if we build our demand for more upon the strength of our own particular integration, with no consideration for the fact that the other person's integration may be in another field or in another facet of his nature, we are certain to be in trouble. The only way that we can really demand more of anyone successfully is to find out what he has and ask for more. We have a right to hope that whatever values he has, he will wish to advance. But if his values are different from ours, we will not get far by demanding of him more of a quality which he does not possess adequately. Therefore, we cannot take the attitude that we are students on a certain level of integration and demand that the other person study the same things on the same level of integration. That may not be where the other person's values lie. Something that is simple for us may be impossible for him, but something that is impossible to us is also possible to him. To compare, therefore, and demand that other persons have the same attitudes, the same values, the same degree of development, and the same conclusions on things, is to turn into a tyrant, forcing a situation that can only lead to further trouble. And a great deal of dishonesty is a form of rebellion. Children who are forbidden to acknowledge their faults with reasonable reprimands, or who are unfairly scolded, become secretive. And the individual who finds that he cannot be himself with those around him is already being indoctrinated in dishonesty. If people will not appreciate him in anything because he is different from them, we have lost everything. And to demand that other persons be like ourselves is one of the most selfish, miserable demands that there is. What we have a right to demand of every other person is that he be true to himself. And if he does this, he will not be likely to injure us or anyone else. But if we are too selfish to permit this, we are to blame. We are to blame whenever we are imposed upon or exploited because of our ignorance. If we buy something we don't understand, if we are cheated, it is almost certain that it is because our own knowledge was inadequate, that we were over-influenced by our emotions, that we were under glamour or something we shouldn't be under, and end up under something we should not be under also. That's debt. We have been talked into something. We have no right to be talked into anything. All decisions should be made thoughtfully and according to wisdom as far as it is given us to be wise. And if we do not know and are willing honestly to admit that we do not know, there is usually some way in which we can get the proper information, usually from a disinterested party. All these things cause us to gradually feel the world is moving in on us and trying to hurt us and trying to make life miserable for us and trying to exploit us. To a measure, we are under tremendous pressure today. But in many, many ways, we could lift a great part of this pressure by not permitting it to move into our personal living and undermine our already insecure footings. And the answer, of course, is the building of securities by facing facts. It's hard, very difficult, to disillusion or disappoint or betray a person who has basic common sense. There has to be some glamour, some illusion, some delusion in order for us to be victims. And it is up to us to see that these glamours and delusions do not exist. But we do not cure them by becoming disillusioned. We cure them by becoming factual, not in a cold or miserable manner, because the facts are not cold and miserable. The facts are that we are a planet of insecure people struggling together, trying to survive, and in each in his own way trying to live well. And if we get together on the thing, we do not contribute to other people's troubles, and because of our integration, they cannot disrupt what security we already possess. We can generally get along, and we can be good friends, and we can have good family relations, and we have good business relations. Because a family relation should not be a battlefield for dominance. It should be distinctly and definitely what it is intended to be, and that is a friendliness of persons working together from common admiration and regard. The moment ulterior motives come in, all these regards evaporate. And they evaporate because of selfishness, because of egoism, because of various weaknesses and pressures and desperations. The answer lies in the relaxing away from these things toward natural security which we possess. To go back to the original thought, if we can get rid of false attitudes, we will find that every one we get rid of takes away attention. And when finally we've gotten rid of a fair number of tensions, our own basic value begins to come through. And out of this basic value, free from false pressures, the individual can make reasonably good decisions and take a reasonable part in society, be trustworthy, and can trust. If he gets to this degree, he has made a major progress in his own life. He is also finding a new faith. He is finding new values and new integrities. And he discovers that he's a finer person than he has ever known, because between himself and his own fineness has been this ghostly structure of his imagination and conceits. When he pierces this and finds himself, he will find that he is a trustworthy person. And if he can hold this attitude in relationship to others, without weakness, without compromise, without being glamorized, he can still then make the generalization that if any other person can get deep enough into himself, he also will be a fine person. and perhaps we can help a little. Not by catering to his weakness, perhaps for a little profit of our own, but simply, quietly calling upon strength and exhibiting our own determination to live according to it. Under those conditions, that which is our own will know our face, as Walt Whitman says. And that which is not right for us or cannot meet this challenge will drift into levels where it can find what it needs. We cannot change everyone, but we can integrate ourselves so that we can become a constructive, positive force also in the lives of others. With these generalities, we can do something and can determine a little better how far we can trust ourselves and others. Well, time is up, so we'll have to let it rest in a moment.